Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started this morning. Welcome to Equipping Hour. For those of you that might be new, my name is Slade. I'm a member here, and I have the privilege of kind of taking us through a class this fall that we're calling Who is God? And I am also excited. So we were talking about the Trinity and the persons of God and the attributes of God and all that sort of stuff. So we're kind of just continuing that discussion today. We've been using A.W. Tozer's book, The Attributes of God, as kind of a outline, kind of a structure, a schedule as we go through. We've talked about the infinitude of God, the immensity, the goodness, and we're kind of continue the goodness conversation a little bit today as we talk about the mercy of God, the mercy of God. A quick announcement. This is a little ways in the future, but on, the weekend after Thanksgiving, which is the 1st, December 1st, that's Sunday, we will not be having Equipping Hour. So remember that, and don't come early because we won't be here. I will remind you, hopefully, if I remember. So just heads up on that. All right. So today, we're going to be talking about God's mercy. We're going to be kind of two different areas. We're going to be talking about what is the mercy of God, how do we know what it is, what is mercy in general, what are kind of the theological discussions happening around the mercy of God. And then we're going to be looking at the book of Jonah as an example of the mercy of God. Let's go ahead and pray before we get started. Lord of all goodness, we come to you this morning in humility, and we ask that you be with us. We are self-seeking creatures plagued with distress and suffering, but your mercies are new every morning, Lord. And we praise you and we thank you for that truth. You are compassionate. You are loving. We ask that you reveal yourself this morning, that you will open our hearts and our minds to hear from you. I ask that falsehood would be forgotten and truth would remain, and that your glory would be proclaimed now and forever. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, so our discussion of mercy this morning is kind of a continuation of our discussion of goodness from a couple weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, we talked about goodness. And when we talked about goodness, we said there was two general areas of God's goodness, and we try to break it down. Does anybody remember one or both of those areas? Pop quiz. Yes, sir. Moral perfection. That is one. Correct. Thank you. And loving kindness is the other area. So God is morally perfect, and he is full of loving kindness. So those are two kind of general areas. Last week, we kind of talked more about the moral perfection of God when we talked about the justice of God. So we talked about that. This week, we're kind of moving more into the loving kindness section as we talk about mercy. So what is the mercy of God? We're going to be talking about what is mercy in general, what are kind of the theological discussions around God's mercy, and what does God's mercy look like. The word mercy is defined as a disposition to be kind and forgiving, kind and compassionate treatment of an offender, enemy, prisoner, or other person under one's power. Synonyms include leniency, clemency, forbearance, and charity. So with this definition of mercy, we kind of have two areas of looking. There's a legal, specific kind of a definition of mercy, and then there's kind of a more general charity version of mercy. Thank you. That's fine. So those are kind of the two areas of the definition. And this more legal, specific definition is the one that I've heard a lot when we talk about mercy. Usually when people are comparing mercy and grace, they have this kind of comparison that they talk about. It's said that grace is unmerited favor, right? Grace is unmerited favor. Or grace is receiving a reward for something that we did not earn, nor do we have any right to, or we do not deserve, right? So that's what grace is. And a mercy is kind of explained as the opposite of that. That mercy is not to not receive the penalty of what is deserved. To not receive the penalty of what is deserved. So that's kind of the idea, the legal specific definition. And that's a good definition of mercy. It's not a bad definition, but it's not quite complete. There's a little bit more to the idea. Mercy is not just not getting punishment that you deserve, but it has more to do with compassion and benevolence to the needy, to the guilty, to the miserable. A.W. Tozer in his book says, according to the Old Testament, mercy has certain meanings. One is to stoop in kindness to an inferior, to have pity upon, and to be actively compassionate. He also says that God's mercy is God's goodness confronting human guilt and suffering. God's mercy is God's goodness confronting human guilt and suffering. Millard Erickson says that God's mercy is his tender-hearted, loving compassion for his people. It is his tenderness of heart toward the needy. His tenderness of heart toward the needy. Norman Geisler says that the Hebrew words associated with God's mercy are ransom, propitiation, words to love, to have compassion, words that mean goodness and kindness, words that mean to pity or to be sympathetic. So all of this kind of sums up what we're talking about when we mean mercy. It's not just the legal definition that we often hear, but it's a little bit more than that. When we say that God is merciful, we are saying that God has active compassion and pity on his creatures. God has active compassion and pity on his creatures. Now, the discussion in theology over mercy kind of gets confused because of this definition, because we often think legality and not specific legality and not general. So because of that, the discussion is over how to categorize God's mercy, how to categorize it. This is because, as our definition shows, there might be two different parts of it, but there's one core of the definition of mercy, and that is mercy requires an object. Mercy requires an object. There cannot be mercy if there is no object to show mercy to. And this is different than other attributes of God that we've talked about. Because other attributes of God do not require an object intrinsically, by definition, or in the same way. Like last week, we talked about justice, right? We talked about justice. Justice, we talked about how justice has to do with equality, has to do with equity, has to do with balance. Justice doesn't require an object. When something comes up against justice, there's judgment. But if nothing comes up against justice, justice still is justice, because it is balance, it is equality, it exists. Or take something like love, for example. Something like love. We talked about a while ago, when we were talking about the Trinity, we talked about Augustine's analogy for the Trinity. And his analogy for the Trinity is the lover, the one who is loved, and the love that is shared between them. The three parts within the Trinity. And that's his analogy. And that is our idea of love. Love requires someone to love. It requires love itself, and it requires the beloved. But all of that idea and expression of love is filled within the Trinity itself. Because the Trinity is consistent. Hold on 1 second here. Love is fulfilled with the Trinity itself by what the Trinity is. The love of God is consistent. It's continuous. It is undivided. It is unseparated. It is unseparated giving and receiving of love consistently and constantly. But it is not, there's no other object outside of the Trinity to do so. It is one within the persons. We talked about the idea of perichoresis, where there is this dance, this giving and receiving of love between the persons of the Trinity, constant and ever-flowing, yet unified and connected and unseparated. So love is consistent within the Trinity itself. But this is not the case with mercy. The persons of the Trinity do not give mercy to another persons of the Trinity, because by definition, mercy requires an inferior, one who is needy, one who is suffering, one who is miserable. And that is not the case within the persons of the Trinity, because they're equal, they are one, they are unified. They share all characteristics together and as one. Because of all this, some theologians want to label the mercy of God as an action of God, something that God does, not something that God is. An action, not an attribute. So there's a discussion going on. How do we understand it? How do we make sense of it? I mean, this does make sense because of the definition of mercy. Mercy is an action. We give mercy to someone. Mercy can be given to us. But Tozer, in his chapter, doesn't quite like that definition. He prefers to think of mercy as something that God is. He wants to say that mercy is both an action and an attribute. He says that as judgment is God's justice confronting moral inequity, so mercy is the goodness of God confronting human suffering and guilt. Where there is no guilt in the world, no pain and no tears, God would yet be infinitely merciful. But his mercy might well remain hidden in his heart, unknown to the created universe. I really like that idea, that God is merciful. Even if there is no object to have mercy upon, God is yet merciful. And this is consistent from what we know and see in Scripture. In Exodus 34, we have a scene where Moses goes on to the Mount Sinai. And we see God represented as a great cloud that descends upon the mountain. And the people of Israel are terrified. And then the Lord comes before him, and he passes before Moses. And Exodus 34, 6-7 says, "And the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but by no means clearing the guilty." The very thing that Moses sees and feels and experiences as God passes before him is his goodness and his mercy. It is core to the experience of who God is. It is foundational to his character and his nature. Mercy is essential to who God is. It is core to him. And he is completely merciful, altogether merciful, infinitely and eternally merciful. We've talked about this over and over each week as we talk about a new attribute of God, and we try to connect them to all the other attributes of God. And we talk about, again, how God is simple. If God is something, he is completely that thing. And all of his other attributes are completely connected with all the other attributes. God is infinitely merciful, just as he is infinitely just, infinitely good, infinitely self-existent, so on and so forth. And he has always been merciful, God has, and always will be merciful, and infinitely so. God cannot be more merciful than he is right now, nor less. Tozer uses the cross as an example of God's mercy in a new way that I hadn't quite heard before. He says, when Jesus died on the cross, the mercy of God did not become any greater. It could not become any greater, for it is already infinite. We get the odd notion that God is showing mercy because Jesus died. No, Jesus died because God is showing mercy. It was the mercy of God that gave us Calvary, not Calvary that gave us mercy. If God had not been merciful, there would have been no incarnation, no babe in a manger, no man on a cross, and no open tomb. Last week, I talked about how the cross is where we see the fullness and the experience of kind of the meeting of the justice and mercy of God. And I stand by that. That's definitely true. We definitely see the connection and the unity of justice and mercy at the cross. But the thing is that justice of God and the mercy of God are always together. They are never apart. And they never contradict and they never war against one another. So of course at the cross, they would be together. The cross is just the place where we as people can see it, can experience it, can grasp it a little bit more, can understand it a little bit better. And that's what's so powerful about it, that God would give us an example and a picture, even above and beyond what the cross accomplished in the atonement. There's one last thing that Tozer talks about in the chapter that I want to mention. It goes something like this. The unity of God and the unity of his attributes, like we just mentioned, doesn't mean that we don't need certain attributes at certain times. And this kind of helps us understand how justice and mercy work together a little bit better. He gives us an example of the Good Samaritan. In the story of the Good Samaritan, the man that was attacked on the road didn't need the Samaritan to apply justice to him or knowledge or power. He needed the mercy of the Samaritan. That's what he needed at the time. That doesn't mean the man wasn't just and wasn't powerful and knowledgeable. Another example is, I don't know about you, but when my wife has a problem, she comes to me and she talks, and I try to solve that problem a lot. And sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes you want to try to solve a problem. So sometimes I try to solve the problem when she doesn't want me to solve the problem. She just wants me to listen to the problem. So at that time, she wants me to be a problem solver. She does. But in that moment, she prefers that I would just listen. That's what she wants. That's what she needs most. She needs me to have sympathy and compassion and just sit and listen and experience it. And that's the same way with God. When we find ourselves in a place where we are broken and suffering and in pain, we need the mercy of God. That doesn't mean God isn't just, or God isn't holy, or God isn't eternal or infinite. It just means that at that time we need the mercy of God. And so that kind of helps us understand how we can kind of connect these two issues that are very different. Okay, so that's kind of that idea of what God's mercy is. Any thoughts or comments or questions on any of that? Yes, sir.
Explain God's mercy during the flood.
God's mercy during the flood. In the same way that I was just mentioned, how different attributes are needed at different times. God is always merciful and infinitely merciful. But God is also just, as we talked about last week, and infinitely so. And so sometimes his justice comes forward and meets the sin of the world. And that's what we have at the time of Noah and the time of the flood. You have a world that has fallen deeply entrenched in sin. Deeply entrenched in sin. As God's response to that is a just response. That the world should be wiped away and the world should be punished for its sin. Logical, consistent with justice. But God's mercy is also present. He saves a few. He doesn't annihilate humanity from existence. He saves humanity. And then we have the great promise of the mercy of God and presented as the rainbow of a promise to never flood the earth again. So we have both of those aspects being represented in the flood. I think that's kind of what you were getting at. But yeah, that's a great picture of the justice of God and the mercy of God. We forget that we get a little prideful in ourselves and forget our position. Humility is not thinking low of yourself. Humility is thinking accurately of yourself. And when you have an accurate view of yourself, you will think lowly of yourself, because we are lowly. But God loves us, right? So we have a certain God image that we bear that has value and purpose and meaning. So that is the idea of humility, and that is kind of what we see in the flood. That's a good question. All right, any other thoughts and questions about that? Yes, you could apply that very same thing to crossing the Red Sea as well. We see the great mercy of God saving Israel, and the justice of God that destroys the Egyptians. Yeah.
So there's a fine line between wrath and justice.
There is a fine line between wrath and justice. Often those are compared. So here's interesting. So mercy, we talked about, is an attribute of God. It is core to his essence. It is central to him. But wrath is not. Wrath is an expression of God's justice. God is not inherently wrathful, right? It is the outcome of his justice. God doesn't want to be wrathful, right? He is long-suffering. He's patient with us. He's merciful with us, right? But he is just, right? But he's not inherently wrathful. So wrath and mercy are not on the same level. God is inherently more merciful than he is wrathful. But that's because wrath is an outcome of justice, right? And so that's kind of how that works together. But yeah, there is a balance there. There definitely is, because God's justice is complete. It is infinite. It is full. And so trying to understand that and make sense of that. But that's an interesting point. And I think that it's important to understand that God is not inherently wrathful. Wrath is not an attribute of God. It comes from him and is holy and it is good. But mercy is. So great question. All right. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example of God's mercy in the book of Jonah. If you have a Bible, go ahead and turn in there. If not, that's cool. I'll be reading kind of verses out of it as we go. And there's a few reasons I want to look at Jonah. The first is that the major theme of Jonah is God's mercy. That is the major theme of Jonah. There's other themes, and people might disagree with that point, but it really is about God's mercy and his character. So a little bit of background about the book of Jonah. It is one of the 12 minor prophets in the Old Testament. Jonah lived around the year 800 BC. This is right after the split into two kingdoms of Israel. You have Solomon, who is the last king of united Israel, and because of his sin, God removed the throne from him and split the kingdom. So this is kind of right after that happening, so that kind of places it in biblical history for us. Also around this time, there's a growing empire north of Israel, and these people were called the Assyrians, or the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrians were a cruel and wicked people. They were very militaristic. They were very focused on conquest. And in the process of this conquest, they did a lot of horrible things and had horrible practices. Torture, bodily mutilation. There's a lot of, we have tablets describing the specific types of vicious and cruel things that they did that I won't get into, but they were extreme. Stuff that would horrify us. And they also practiced this idea of total war, where they would go into a place that they conquered and they would destroy everything. Right? They would kill everything, burn everything down, all the crops and the orchard and the animals, and then they would salt the earth so nothing could grow or live. So even if you survived them coming through and destroying everything, you would die of starvation or be forced to leave. So they were a cruel people and powerful, very brutal. And not only that, but the Assyrians were in constant warfare with Israel at this point. They were harassing Israel. They were in on and off wars and battles throughout this time. And Jonah was in the northern kingdom, so he had direct conflict with these people. And the capital of Assyria, as we will see in Jonah, was the city of Nineveh. And so this is kind of the background and context that we have as we go into looking at the book of Jonah. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the story, but we're kind of look at hopefully a little bit differently as we go through. All right, let's start just in verse 1, chapter 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise and go to Nineveh, that great city, and cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah arose to flee to Tarshish, from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. All right, so here we have Jonah the prophet. He's already a prophet at this time. And God tells him to come up and go to Nineveh because their sin has come up against them. Proclaim judgment to the city of Nineveh. And that all makes sense. But Jonah decides not to do that. Right? He runs away. In fact, he runs the opposite direction, as far as he can go, basically. Tarshish, we think, was in Spain, which is very far from Israel in that time. And it still is far, it's true. And so he not only goes, Nineveh is inland, right? But Joppa on the coast is on the coast, so it's further away. So he actually goes the exact opposite direction. He goes south and west as opposed to north and east where he's supposed to go. So he goes the exact opposite direction. I've been doing translation of Jonah in my Hebrew class, which is convenient. There's an interesting connection between the words that mean to go up or to ascend or to rise up in Jonah and the words that mean to descend or to go down to. And we see it right here in this first passage a little bit. God says, "Arise and go to Nineveh." Yet Jonah decides to go down to Joppa. And the idea is that to rise and to go up means to be obedient and to come closer to God, and to descend or to go down means to be disobedient and to go further away from God, both literally and figuratively. So that's an interesting kind of theological in the Hebrew that you can see. And the New King James, or the King James Version, kind of gives you that translation, which is kind of fun. Anyway, that's kind of a second issue, but I just thought it was interesting. All right, so then we have God comes up with a big storm, right? A storm so extreme that even the sailors are terrified. And then what does Jonah decide to do? He goes and decides to sleep even further in the ship. That's the place he's at right now. Depressed and sad and trying to sleep in an extreme storm. So all the sailors come and they get him and they try to figure out what's going on. Why is this extreme storm happening? And he finally admits what's going on, who he is, where he's from, and why this storm is. And he finally says, fine, throw me over the side. And so they do that. Even though they don't want to, they decide to throw him over. And the great fish comes and swallows him. So not only does he go down, he goes down even further into the ocean, even further into disobedience. And the great fish swallows him. And then he has his moment of revelation. He repents. He turns back to God and thanks him for his salvation, for sending the fish to save him from the storm and the ocean and the sea and drowning. And then again in chapter 3, the beginning of chapter 3, verse 1, it says again, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, 'Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and preach to it the message that I will tell you.' So Jonah arose." So he goes up this time. He's in obedience. "And went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord." So he goes to Nineveh and he preaches judgment against them. He says they will be destroyed in 40 days. So the message gets around and the city of Nineveh repents. City of Nineveh repents. Even the king proclaims that everyone should put on their mourning clothes of sackcloth and repent and turn away from the evil that they do. In chapter 3, verse 10, it says, "Then God saw their works and that they turned from their evil way. And God relented from the disaster that he had said he would bring upon them. And he did not do it." Continuing in chapter 4. "But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry. So he prayed to the Lord and said, 'O Lord, was this not what I said when I was still in my country? Therefore I fled previously to Tarshish. For I know that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live.'" Now in this context, we can kind of, as looking back, as we kind of go through the book of Jonah, we'll get to the end here in a second. Jonah's position seems kind of strange at first, why Jonah would not want to pronounce judgment on the city of Nineveh. Nineveh was their enemy. Assyrians were their enemy. He would want them to be judged for their sins and their crimes and their brutality. They were evil people in Jonah's eyes. It makes sense that God would pronounce judgment on their wickedness. But Jonah knows God. He knows that God is merciful. He knows that God is full of loving kindness. And we see here in chapter 4 that Jonah does not want God to have mercy on these people. He does not want that to happen. And this is another big thing of the book of Jonah. But this for a different time. So we see in chapter 4 that God kind of teaches Noah a lesson for his lack of mercy, for his lack of understanding and compassion on the people of Nineveh. He sends a plant while Jonah's hanging out, waiting to see kind of what happens. He sends a plant to kind of give him some shade, and then he takes away the plant. And Jonah's upset about this. He's sad about the plant dying because now he doesn't have any shade. And then God said to Jonah, "Is it right?" This is verse 9, chapter 4. And God said to Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry about the plant?" And he said, "Is it right for me to be angry?" It is right. This is Jonah talking. "It is right for me to be angry even to death." So he's indignant. But the Lord said, "You have had pity on the plant for which you have not labored, nor made it grow, which came up in a night and perished in a night." And God says, "And should I not have pity on Nineveh, that great city in which are more than 120,000 persons who cannot discern between their right hand and their left?" Cannot discern between their right hand and their left. So God teaches Jonah a lesson. God has mercy on the cruel and the wicked and the brutal. He has mercy on the liar and the sluggard and the lustful and the greedy. God even has mercy on the disobedient. For Nineveh, he shows a great mercy to Nineveh, God does. These cruel and wicked people, undeserving of mercy, undeserving of forgiveness, who are brutal in their actions and their lives. But he shows mercy on them. But Nineveh is not the only one that God shows mercy to here. He shows mercy to Jonah as well. The Assyrians maybe could be forgiven because they were naive. They did not know what they did. It says in chapter 4 that they did not know their right from their left. But Jonah knew God. He was a prophet of God. He spoke with God. He heard directly from God. And he blatantly disobeyed a commandment. But God has mercy on him. He sends the storm to stop Jonah from running away, and he sends the fish to save him. He returns Jonah to himself. God had compassion and pity and loving kindness and mercy on Jonah and the people of Nineveh. And that is because of who he is. It is core to who he is and is what he does. So that's kind of an overlook, an idea of the greatness of the mercy of God. So just wrapping up what we talked about today. We talked about the mercy of God. We said the mercy of God means that God has compassion and pity upon his creation. We said that the mercy of God is both an attribute of God and an action of God. It is something God is, and it is something God does. We looked at the book of Jonah as a great example of God's mercy and his infiniteness and his greatness and his goodness. God is always merciful to us. I love that his mercies are new every morning. We cannot run out of mercy of God. It's not possible. When you think the mercy of God is filled up and you've had all the mercy and blessing you can have, you just discover more each and every day. That is the goodness and the mercy of God. All right, so that's it for today. Next week we're going to be talking about grace, and hopefully I won't screw up talking about the name of the church as we go through. That would be bad. But anyway, we'll see you next time. So thanks, everybody.